History tells us that power bows to no one. We are told that a duke is a king in his own castle, and that a woman without a name is nothing more than dust on the floorboards. But they were wrong. In 1889, the high society of Derbyshire witnessed the impossible. They watched a man who had not spoken in 10 years, a man they called a monster, fall to his knees in the middle of a crowded ballroom. Not for a queen, not for a duchess, but for a penniless girl wearing a mended dress who everyone said was unworthy to even breathe the same air. This is the true, untold story of Ilara Vance and the Silent Duke, and it begins with a betrayal that almost buried them both. The iron gates of Blackwood Manor did not welcome visitors. They loomed like skeletal fingers, warning them away. Ilara Vance shivered, pulling her thin, charcoal-grey shawl tighter around her shoulders. The carriage that had brought her from the station had refused to drive up the gravel path, dumping her and her single, battered trunk at the entrance in the pouring rain. The driver had muttered something about bad blood and cursed grounds before whipping his horses into a frenzy to escape. Ilara didn't have the luxury of believing in curses. She had exactly 3 shillings in her pocket, a stomach that hadn't seen a warm meal in 2 days, and a letter of employment that felt too good to be true. Archivist needed. Discretion required. Generous stipend. She dragged her trunk through the mud, the rain plastering her dark hair to her forehead. She wasn't a beauty by society's standards. Her jaw was too sharp, her eyes too observant, and her hands were stained with ink rather than softened by rosewater. She was the daughter of Elias Vance, a brilliant historian who had died in disgrace, leaving her with nothing but his debts and his books. When she finally reached the massive oak doors, she didn't knock. She pounded. The door creaked open, revealing a woman who looked as though she had been carved from granite. Mrs. Halloway, the head housekeeper, wore black stiff enough to crack a whip against. "You're late," Halloway said, her voice devoid of warmth. "And you're soaking wet. You'll ruin the rugs." "The driver left me at the gate," Ilara said, refusing to apologize. "I am Ilara Vance. I am here for the library." Halloway sneered, looking Ilara up and down. "I told Mr. Thorne a woman wouldn't last a week. You look like a drowned rat, not a scholar. Leave your trunk. If you're still here in the morning, which I doubt, the footman will fetch it." Ilara stepped inside. The foyer was cavernous, lit only by dying embers in a massive hearth. The air smelled of beeswax, damp stone, and something metallic, like old blood or rusted iron. "Rules!" Halloway barked, walking briskly down a dimly lit corridor. 1. You are to catalogue the West Wing library. 2. You are to take your meals in the kitchen, not the staff hall. You are neither family nor servant, so you fit nowhere. Halloway stopped abruptly in front of a heavy door reinforced with iron bands. "And 3, the housekeeper whispered, her eyes narrowing. "You never, under any circumstances, approach the master. If you see him, you look down. If he enters a room, you leave it. He is not right, and he does not tolerate strays." "The Duke?" Ilara asked. "I thought he was abroad." "He is a ghost in his own house, Miss Vance," Halloway said, opening the door to a small, dusty room that smelled of mildew. "And ghosts are best left undisturbed. This is your room. Candlelight out by 9. The door clicked shut, leaving Ilara in darkness. That night, the storm raged harder. Ilara lay on the lumpy mattress, staring at the ceiling. She thought she heard footsteps in the hallway outside, heavy, dragging footsteps, like a man carrying a burden too heavy to bear. She crept to the door and cracked it open an inch. At the far end of the corridor, a shadow moved. It was a man, towering and broad-shouldered, silhouetted by a flash of lightning from a window. He paused, his head turning slightly. Even in the dark, Ilara felt the weight of his gaze. It felt primal, dangerous. Then from the shadows behind him, another figure appeared, slimmer, elegant. It was a man holding a candelabra. "Go back to your cage, Arthur," the slim man hissed. The voice was smooth, cultured, and cruel. "Before I call the doctor again." The large man flinched, actually flinched, and retreated into the darkness. Ilara closed the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She realized then that the bad blood the driver mentioned wasn't a ghost story. It was something living in this house. 3 days passed, and Ilara had not seen the Duke again. Her world was the West Wing Library. It was a chaotic masterpiece, a 2-story cathedral of knowledge that had been allowed to rot. Books were piled in hazardous towers. Maps from the 1700s were being used as coasters. It was a historian's nightmare. But for Ilara, it was a sanctuary. She worked with a feverish intensity. She needed to prove she was indispensable before Holloway found an excuse to fire her. It was late afternoon on Thursday when the silence broke. Ilara was atop a ladder, trying to retrieve a heavy ledger bound in cracked red leather when the library door slammed open. The draft caught her off guard. She wobbled, the heavy book slipping from her dust-covered gloves. It plummeted down, hitting the floor with a thunderous crack. "Get out!" The voice wasn't a scream. It was a guttural roar, raw and unused. Ilara scrambled down the ladder, her pulse racing. Standing in the center of the room was the man she had seen in the hallway. Duke Arthur Blackwood was terrifying. He stood over 6'4", his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, revealing a jagged scar that ran from his collarbone up the side of his neck. His hair was black and wild, his face covered in a rough beard. But it was his eyes, storm grey and filled with a frantic, trapped panic, that froze her. He was gripping a chair so hard the wood groaned. I apologize, Your Grace," Ilara stammered, curtsying clumsily. "I dropped the ledger. I will fix it." "Leave," he rasped. He sounded like he was choking on the words. He took a step toward her, and she saw he was favoring his left leg. "Leave me." Most women would have run. Holloway had warned her. The village gossip said he had killed his own brother in a fit of rage. But Ilara Vance was a scholar, and scholars noticed details others missed. She noticed he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the sunlight streaming through the high windows, shielding his eyes as if the light physically hurt him. She noticed the tremor in his hands was not rage, but exhaustion. "I cannot leave, Your Grace," Ilara said, her voice trembling but firm. "I haven't finished the inventory for the B section. If I leave now, I'll lose my place." Arthur stopped. The sheer audacity of her refusal seemed to short-circuit his anger. He slowly lowered his hand and looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. "You refuse?" he grunted. "I am paid to organize, not to run," she said, stooping to pick up the fallen book. She dusted it off gently. "Besides, this is a first edition of Milton. It deserves better than to be thrown about." Arthur stared at the book in her hands. A strange expression crossed his face, a mixture of pain and recognition. "My father loved that book," he whispered. The roughness in his voice softened, revealing a deep, baritone timbre that vibrated in the quiet room. "Then he had excellent taste," Ilara said. She took a risk. She walked to the heavy velvet drapes and pulled them halfway shut, dimming the blinding afternoon sun. "Is that better?" Arthur's shoulders slumped, the tension draining from his massive frame. He looked at the dimmed window, then back at her with a look of profound confusion. No one had accommodated him in years. They had only drugged him or yelled at him. "Who are you?" he asked. "Elara Vance, your archivist." "I did not hire an archivist," he said, his brow furrowing. "Mr. Julian Thorn did," she replied. At the mention of the name, the rage returned instantly. Arthur snarled, sweeping a stack of papers off a nearby table. "Julian, he wants to count the assets. He wants to know what is left to sell." He turned on Elara, looming over her. "You are his spy. You are here to tally my worth so he can sell the roof over my head?" Elara didn't back down, though every instinct screamed at her to flee. She held up the book like a shield. "I am no one's spy. I am a woman who needs this wage to eat. I don't care about your assets, Your Grace. I care about the books. If Mr. Thorn wants to sell them, he will have to drag them out over my cold body, because half of these need restoration before they can even be touched." Silence stretched between them. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly. Arthur studied her. He saw the frayed cuffs of her dress, the ink stain on her chin, and the defiant fire in her eyes. For the first time in a decade, the corner of his mouth twitched. "You would die for a book?" "I have very little else to live for," she answered honestly. Arthur let out a breath that sounded like a rusty laugh. "Then you are as mad as they say I am." He turned and limped toward the door. Before he left, he paused, his back to her. "The blue ledger on the top shelf," he said low. "Hide it. If Julian finds it, he will burn it." "Why?" "Because it contains the truth," Arthur said, opening the door. "And in this house, Miss Vance, the truth is the most dangerous thing of all." He vanished into the hallway. Elara stood frozen. She looked up at the top shelf. Hidden behind a row of encyclopedias was a slim blue volume. She climbed the ladder and retrieved it. She opened the cover. It wasn't a financial ledger. It was a medical journal, handwritten by the late doctor of the estate. The first entry read, October 12th, 1879. "The young Duke exhibits no signs of madness, yet his symptoms worsen after every meal prepared by the new cook. I suspect arsenic." Elara gasped, nearly dropping the book again. Arthur wasn't mad. He was being poisoned. And the man who hired her, Julian Thorn, the elegant man in the hallway, was likely the one doing it. She had walked into a murder in progress, and now she was the only one who knew. For the next week, Elara Vance played a dangerous game. She became a ghost in the house, much like the Duke himself. She spent her days visibly dusting and cataloguing in the library, making sure to look busy whenever Mrs. Halloway marched past the open doors. But her mind was entirely focused on the blue medical journal hidden beneath her mattress. She had read it cover to cover 3 times. The symptoms described by the late Dr. Sterling, tremors, sensitivity to light, paranoia, and muscle weakness, matched Arthur's condition perfectly. But the most damning evidence was the timeline. Arthur's madness always flared up after the monthly visits from his cousin, Julian Thorn. Elara realized she had to control what the Duke consumed. But how? She was a nobody, an archivist with no access to the kitchens. Her opportunity came on a Tuesday. It was the day the butcher delivered the weekly supplies. Mrs. Halloway was distracted, arguing over the price of lamb shanks at the service entrance. Elara slipped into the scullery. The kitchen was a humid, bustling place, but she stayed in the shadows of the pantry. She watched as a young maid prepared a tray for the West Wing, a silver pot of tea, a plate of biscuits, and a small crystal decanter of medicinal tonic. Elara watched, holding her breath as Halloway returned, shooed the maid away, and unlocked a high cupboard. The housekeeper took down a small, unmarked green vial. She added 3 drops to the tonic. 3 drops, enough to keep him weak, but not enough to kill him instantly. They were slowly erasing him. As Halloway turned to scold the butcher again, Elara moved. It was a reckless, stupid impulse, born of desperation. She grabbed the tray, dumped the contents of the tonic into a nearby potted fern, and replaced it with water from the pitcher on the table. She added a splash of the tea to color it brown. She was back in the corridor before her heart stopped hammering. Later that afternoon, the library door creaked open. Arthur entered. He looked worse than before, pale, sweating, his shirt clinging to his broad chest. He limped to his usual chair in the corner, away from the windows. "You're still here," he grumbled, though the bite was gone from his voice. "I told you, I have work to do," Elara said, not looking up from her desk. "And so do you." Arthur blinked, confused. "Me? I found a chessboard in the cupboard," she said, gesturing to a small table she had set up near his chair. "It seems a shame to let it gather dust, unless you've forgotten how to play." It was a challenge. Arthur Blackwood, before his decline, had been a brilliant strategist, a military man. He stared at the board, then at her. "I am not fit for company, Miss Vance. My hands shake." "Then let them shake," she said softly. "But play." Arthur sat. He reached for a pawn. His hand trembled violently, but he moved the piece. They played in silence for an hour. And then the maid brought the tray Elara had tampered with. Arthur reached for the crystal decanter. Elara's breath hitched. If he tasted the difference. He downed the glass in one swallow. He paused, frowning. He looked at the glass, then at Elara. "It tastes different," he murmured. "Weak." "Perhaps your palate is improving," Elara said, her voice steady, despite the panic rising in her throat. "Or perhaps the previous batches were simply spoiled." Arthur looked at her, his grey eyes narrowing. He wasn't stupid. He saw the tension in her shoulders. He looked at the empty glass, then at the healthy, vibrant fern in the corner of the room, the only plant that seemed to be thriving. He didn't say a word. But for the rest of the game, when his hand hovered over the board, the shaking was less severe. By the end of the week, the change was miraculous. Without the daily dose of arsenic, the fog in Arthur's mind began to clear. He stood straighter. The sensitivity to light decreased. He even shaved the unruly beard, revealing a strong, aristocratic jawline that made Elara stare a second too long when he walked in. But with his recovery came a new danger. Julian Thorne arrived on Saturday. He didn't come alone. He brought a solicitor, Mr. Finch, a man with eyes like a rodent, and a briefcase full of eviction papers. Elara was on the ladder when they entered the library, unannounced. "It's tragic, really," Julian was saying to the lawyer, his voice dripping with false sorrow. "My cousin is entirely invalid. The estate is bleeding money. We have no choice but to declare him incompetent and liquidate the assets to pay for his institutional care." "I see," Mr. Finch muttered. "And the staff?" "Dismissed, of course. We'll sell the manor house first." "I don't think so." The voice came from the shadows of the mezzanine. It was deep, resonant, and controlled. Arthur stepped out from behind a row of shelves. He was dressed in a clean black coat, his hair combed back. He looked every inch a duke. Julian froze. His face went pale, his composure cracking for a fraction of a second. "Arthur? You're out of bed." "I am," Arthur said, descending the stairs. He didn't use the railing. His limp was barely noticeable. "And I am not invalid, Julian. Nor am I incompetent." He stopped in front of his cousin. Arthur towered over the slim, elegant man. "You can send Mr. Finch away," Arthur said, calmly. "I will not be signing any papers today. In fact, I intend to review the estate accounts myself, this evening." Julian's eyes darted to Elara, who was watching from the ladder. He made the connection instantly. The archivist. The woman who controlled the library, and he suspected the woman who had been interfering with the kitchen orders. "Of course, cousin," Julian smiled, though his eyes were cold as ice. "I am overjoyed to see you so spirited. It must be the country air." He turned to leave, but stopped at the door. He looked directly at Alara. "Miss Vance," Julian said. "A word? I believe there is an issue with your employment contract." Alara gripped the ladder. "My contract is with the estate, Mr. Thorn." "Indeed," Julian whispered. "And accidents happen so frequently on these old estates. Do be careful." The threat was not subtle. After Julian's visit, the atmosphere in Blackwood Manor shifted from oppressive to predatory. Mrs. Halloway stopped speaking to Alara entirely. The food left for Alara in the kitchen began to smell strange, sour, off-putting. Alara stopped eating anything she hadn't bought herself from the village. But the real attack didn't come through food. It came through gravity. 2 days after the confrontation, Arthur had left the manor for the first time in years to inspect the tenant farms. He had insisted on going alone, riding his black stallion, Midnight. It was a show of strength to the villagers, proof that the Mad Duke was back. That left Alara alone in the house with Halloway and the staff. She was in the East Gallery, a long, high-ceilinged corridor lined with portraits of Arthur's ancestors. Julian had sent a note requesting a specific file on the lineage, a meaningless task meant to keep her busy. The gallery was lit by a massive crystal chandelier, a monstrosity of glass and iron that weighed as much as a carriage. Alara was searching through a cabinet beneath the chandelier when she heard a strange sound. Click, click, snap. It sounded like metal straining under tension. She looked up. High above, near the ceiling rosette, the heavy iron chain holding the chandelier was unraveling. It wasn't rusting. It had been filed down. The fresh metal glinted in the sunlight. She had a split second to realize what was happening. She lunged forward, throwing herself toward the far wall. Crash! The sound was deafening, like a bomb going off. The floorboards shattered. Shards of crystal exploded like shrapnel, flying in every direction. A wave of dust and plaster knocked the wind out of her. Alara lay on the floor, coughing, her ears ringing. A jagged piece of glass the size of a dagger was embedded in the floorboard inches from her face. If she had been 1 second slower, she would have been crushed. "Miss Vance!" The shout came from the entrance. Servants came running, Mrs. Halloway among them. But Halloway didn't look shocked. She looked disappointed. "Clumsy," Halloway muttered, staring at the wreckage. "Look at this mess. Mr. Thorn will be furious about the antique glass." "It fell," Alara gasped, trying to stand. Her knees were bleeding. "The chain, it was cut." "Don't be ridiculous," Halloway snapped. "Old houses rot. You were lucky. Go to your room and pack. You are clearly bad luck for this house. First the master's illness, now this. You leave tonight." "She stays." The voice thundered from the end of the hall. Arthur stood there, still wearing his riding cloak, mud on his boots. He had returned early. He looked at the shattered chandelier, then at Alara, who was bleeding and shaking on the floor. His face went terrifyingly blank. It was the face of a soldier who had just decided to go to war. He walked over to Alara, ignoring the glass crunching under his boots. He didn't ask if she was okay. He knelt down, this giant, silent man, and scooped her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing. "Your Grace," Halloway gasped, scandalized. "She is a servant. You cannot—" "Silence," Arthur said. The word was soft, but it carried so much violence that Halloway took a step back. "Prepare the blue guest room," Arthur commanded. The maids gasped. The blue room was reserved for royalty. It was next to the Duke's own chambers. But "If the room is not ready in 10 minutes, Arthur said, looking Holloway dead in the eye, "you will be out on the street before the sun sets. Do you understand me?" Holloway paled. "Yes, Your Grace." Arthur carried Elara up the grand staircase. She was acutely aware of his warmth, the smell of leather and rain on his cloak, and the steady, furious beating of his heart against her cheek. "You didn't have to do that," Elara whispered, wincing as the movement tugged at a cut on her arm. "They will talk." "Let them talk," Arthur growled. "They tried to kill you, Elara." It was the first time he had used her first name. He kicked open the door to the guest room and laid her gently on the silk coverlet. He turned to the basin, pouring water and dampening a cloth himself, refusing to wait for the maids. "Why?" he asked, his voice breaking as he gently wiped the dust from her face. "Why are you doing this? Why stay? I am a broken man with a target on my back. You owe me nothing." Elara looked at him, the monster of Blackwood Manor. He was tending to her wounds with hands that were calloused but infinitely gentle. "Because," she said, her voice trembling, "you are the only one in this world who has looked at me and seen a person, not a utility. And because I know the truth, Arthur." He froze, the cloth hovering over her cheek. "What truth?" "You aren't mad," she said firmly. "You are being poisoned. Arsenic. I found the doctor's journal. Julian and Holloway. They have been doing it for years." The silence that followed was heavy. Arthur closed his eyes. He didn't look surprised. He looked resigned. "I suspected," he admitted, his voice a low rumble. "But I thought I deserved it. For what happened to my brother." "No one deserves this," she said, grabbing his hand. "But now they know that I know. That chandelier wasn't an accident. It was a warning." Arthur's eyes opened. The grey was gone, replaced by a burning obsidian black. He squeezed her hand, careful not to crush it. "Then I have a warning for them," he said. He stood up, his height filling the room. "Rest, Elara. Tonight I dine with my cousin, and I think it is time the silent Duke had a very loud conversation." Arthur turned and walked out of the room. For the first time in 10 years, he didn't lock his door. He left it open, standing guard over the hallway. Downstairs, the carriage of Julian Thorn was pulling up the driveway. The final act had begun. The dinner was not merely a meal, it was an execution ground. Julian Thorn had moved quickly, unsettled by Arthur's sudden recovery and the accident with the chandelier. He had summoned the pillars of Derbyshire society to Blackwood Manor that very evening. His excuse was a celebration of the Duke's health, but his intent was clear to anyone who knew the game. He needed witnesses. He needed the magistrate, the bishop, and the local gentry to see Arthur snap. He needed to prove that the Duke was a danger to himself and others, cementing the need for institutionalization. The dining room was ablaze with light, too much light. Julian had ordered every candelabra lit, knowing Arthur's eyes were sensitive. The table was set for 12. Elara stood at the top of the servants' stairs, hesitating. She wore a dress she had found in the back of the wardrobe in the blue room, a deep midnight velvet that was decades out of fashion, smelling of lavender and sorrow. It was too tight in the bodice and too long in the hem, but it was the only thing that wasn't a servant's uniform. "You look like a queen going to the gallows," a voice whispered. She turned to see Arthur. He was dressed in formal evening wear, a high-collared black coat that emphasized the sheer breadth of his shoulders. He looked dangerous. The scars on his soul were hidden, but the scar on his neck was visible, a stark reminder of his history. "They are waiting for you to fail," Elara said softly. "Let them wait," Arthur replied. He offered her his arm. "Tonight, Elara, You do not look down. You do not curtsy. You are my guest, and in this house, my word is law." When the double doors opened, the conversation in the dining room died instantly. Julian stood at the head of the table, holding a crystal wine glass. To his right sat Lord Harrington, the chief magistrate, a man with a face like a bulldog and a strict adherence to rules. To his left was Dr. Morcott, a thin, bird-like man who ran the local asylum. They all turned. They expected a raving madman. Instead, they saw Duke Arthur Blackwood walking with a steady, predatory grace, a woman in velvet on his arm. "Good evening," Arthur's voice boomed, deep and clear. It resonated off the mahogany walls. "I apologize for the delay. I was attending to the housekeeping." He stared directly at Julian. Julian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Arthur," Julian said, recovering quickly, "we are overjoyed. And who is this? I wasn't aware we had additional guests." "This is Miss Elara Vance," Arthur said, guiding Elara to the chair at his right hand, the seat of honor. "My personal archivist, and the savior of the Blackwood Library." A ripple of shock went through the room. A woman? An employee? Seated at the right hand of a duke? Mrs. Halloway, standing by the sideboard, looked as if she had swallowed a lemon. "Highly irregular," Lord Harrington grunted, adjusting his monocle. "Dining with the staff, Arthur?" "I find the staff often have more integrity than the family, Lord Harrington," Arthur said smoothly, sitting down. "Wine." The dinner was a minefield. Every course was a test. Julian steered the conversation toward topics meant to trigger Arthur. The fire that had killed his parents, the war, the voices he used to hear. "It must be difficult," Dr. Morcott said, cutting his steak with surgical precision. "To be shut away in the dark for so long. The mind wanders. Do you still see the shadows, Your Grace?" Elara stiffened. She reached for her water glass, her hand brushing Arthur's sleeve under the table. "A signal." "Stay calm." Arthur smiled, a cold, humorless curving of his lips. "I see many shadows, Doctor. Usually they are cast by men waiting to pick my pockets." Lord Harrington choked on his wine. "But tell me, Julian," Arthur continued, turning to his cousin, "how are the estate finances? I noticed the timber yields were down 40% last year. Curious, given the price of oak has risen." Julian flushed. "The market is volatile, Arthur. You wouldn't understand the complexities." "I understand theft," Arthur interrupted. The room went deathly silent. "I understand," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper, "that a man who poisons his own bloodline to inherit a title is not a businessman, he is a parasite." Julian stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "How dare you? You are unwell, Arthur. The madness is speaking." "Is it?" Arthur stood as well. He picked up his wine glass, the glass Halloway had just filled. He held it out to Julian. "Drink it," Arthur commanded. "What?" "If I am mad and you are a loving cousin, then drink my wine. Let us toast to my health." Julian stared at the glass. Beads of sweat broke out on his upper lip. He knew what was in the special decanter Halloway used for the Duke. A heavy dose of laudanum and arsenic, meant to make Arthur collapse in front of the magistrate tonight. I have my own," Julian stammered. "Drink it!" Arthur roared, slamming the glass down on the table so hard the stem snapped. Red wine spilled across the white tablecloth like a blood stain. "He cannot drink it." Elara's voice cut through the tension. She stood up, trembling but resolute. "Because it is poisoned." She reached into the pocket of her velvet dress and pulled out the blue medical journal. "This is the journal of the late Dr. Sterling," she announced to the room. "It details 6 years of systematic poisoning, symptoms that match the Duke's condition perfectly." symptoms that vanish when he eats food prepared by his own hands. She slammed the book onto the table in front of Lord Harrington. "Read it, my lord. The dates of the illness coincide exactly with Mr. Thorn's visits." Lord Harrington looked from the book to Julian, his bulldog face twisting in suspicion. He reached for the journal. "That is a forgery!" Julian shrieked, his facade finally shattering. "She is a liar, a beggar I hired out of pity. She has seduced him. She has twisted his mind." "Enough." Arthur didn't shout. He didn't have to. The authority in his voice was absolute. He looked at Julian with a mixture of pity and disgust. "Get out of my house, Julian. Take your doctors and your schemes. If you are not off my land in the hour, I will hunt you down like the fox you are." Julian looked at the magistrate. Harrington was reading the journal, his brow furrowing. He looked at Dr. Morcott, who was inching toward the door. Julian had lost. He sneered, straightening his jacket. "You think you've won, Arthur? You think you can play the Lord with this gutter snipe by your side? You have no idea what you've done." He looked at Elara with pure, distilled hatred. "Enjoy your victory, Miss Vance. It will be short-lived." Julian stormed out. The dinner party was in ruins, but for the first time in 10 years, the air in Blackwood Manor felt clean. Or so they thought. The victory lasted exactly 12 hours. The next morning, Elara awoke to the sound of screaming. She sat up in the blue room, her heart pounding. The sun was barely up. She threw on her robe and ran into the hallway. Below in the foyer, chaos reigned. Julian Thorn had returned, and he had brought the police. Constable Miller, a stern man with a thick moustache, stood at the bottom of the stairs, flanked by 2 deputies. But the real threat stood behind them. It was Dr. Morcott, holding a piece of paper stamped with the official seal of the High Court. "What is the meaning of this?" Arthur's voice thundered from the landing. He was shirtless, having clearly just woken up, a sword, an actual cavalry saber, gripped in his hand. "Put the weapon down, Your Grace," Constable Miller said nervously, hand hovering over his baton. "Arthur Blackwood." Julian stepped forward, looking triumphant. He held up a small velvet bag. "We are not here for you. Not yet." He tossed the bag to the constable. Miller opened it and poured the contents into his hand. Diamonds, a necklace, earrings, and a heavy brooch. The Blackwood heirlooms. "We found these in Miss Vance's trunk," Julian said, smiling a viper's smile. "Hidden in the false bottom. Theft of grand larceny. The penalty is hanging." Elara froze on the stairs. "That's a lie. I never touched them." "And," Julian continued, raising his voice over hers, "Dr. Morcott has sworn an affidavit. He witnessed the Duke's erratic behavior last night. It is his professional opinion that the Duke is under the hypnotic influence of this woman, who has exploited his mental fragility to rob the estate blind." "You snake," Arthur growled, taking a step down the stairs. The deputies drew their truncheons. "Careful, Arthur," Julian warned. "Attack an officer of the law, and you prove Dr. Morcott right. You'll be in a straitjacket by noon, and she will be in a cell." It was a perfect trap. If Arthur fought, he was mad. If he did nothing, Elara was doomed. Constable Miller looked up at Elara. "Miss Vance, you are under arrest. Come down quietly." "She is innocent," Arthur roared. "He planted them." "Can you prove it?" Lord Harrington asked. The magistrate had walked in through the open door, looking grim. "The jewels were in her room, Arthur. I saw them, found myself. The law is the law." Arthur looked at Harrington, then at Julian. He saw the smirk on his cousin's face. Julian knew he had won. He had used Arthur's greatest weakness against him, his isolation. Who would believe the mad Duke over the sane, respectable cousin? 2 deputies marched up the stairs and grabbed Elara. "No!" she cried, struggling. "Arthur!" They dragged her down the stairs. She looked small and helpless between the burly men. They forced her to her knees on the marble floor to handcuff her. "Take her away," Julian commanded, "and prepare the carriage for the asylum. The Duke needs rest." The room seemed to tilt. Arthur stood on the stairs, the sword hanging loosely in his hand. He looked at Elara. She was on her knees, hair dishevelled, eyes filled with tears of terror. Everyone was looking at her with disgust. The thief, the manipulator, the nobody. Unworthy. That was the word they whispered. She was unworthy of him, unworthy of the title, unworthy of mercy. Arthur made a decision. He dropped the sword. It clattered loudly on the stone steps. He walked down the stairs, slow and deliberate. The deputies stepped back, intimidated by his sheer size. He walked past Julian. He walked past the magistrate. He stopped in front of Elara. The room held its breath. Was he going to strike her? Was he going to denounce her to save himself? Arthur Blackwood, the Duke of Derbyshire, a man who answered to no one, slowly bent his knees. He sank down until he was kneeling on the dirty floor in front of her. He was eye level with the thief. "Your Grace," Constable Miller whispered, shocked. "What are you doing? Get up." Arthur ignored him. He reached out and took Elara's handcuffed hands in his own large, warm ones. He bowed his head, pressing his forehead against her knuckles in a gesture of absolute, submissive reverence. It was the pose of a knight before his queen. "I, Arthur James Blackwood," he said, his voice ringing with a power that shook the glass in the windows, "do hereby declare this woman, Elara Vance, to be my betrothed." Julian gasped. "You can't! She is a thief!" Arthur raised his head, his eyes burning with a cold, brilliant fire. He looked at the magistrate. "She cannot steal what is already hers, Lord Harrington. By the ancient laws of this estate, the Duchess holds joint ownership of all family heirlooms. If she is my intended, she has every right to have those jewels in her trunk. She was inspecting them for the wedding." "This is madness!" Julian screamed. "He is hallucinating. There was no engagement." Arthur stood up, pulling Elara up with him. He kept her hand firmly in his. "There is now," Arthur said. He looked at the constable. "Unless you intend to arrest the future Duchess of Derbyshire for holding her own property, I believe that would be false imprisonment. I have a very expensive lawyer in London who would destroy you for it." Constable Miller went pale. He looked at the diamonds, then at the furious Julian, and finally at the towering, lucid Duke holding the hand of the woman he had just knelt before. If she is your betrothed, Your Grace," Miller stammered, holstering his baton, "then it is a domestic matter, not a crime." "Unlock her," Arthur commanded. The deputy scrambled to unlock the cuffs. Arthur rubbed Elara's chafed wrists. He turned to Julian, whose face had turned a violent shade of purple. "You have played your last card, cousin," Arthur said softly. "Now get off my land, and take Mrs. Halloway with you. If I see either of you again, I will not call the constable. I will release the hounds." Julian looked around. He saw the magistrate nodding in agreement with the Duke. He saw the tide turning. With a noise of pure frustration, Julian turned and fled, pushing past Dr. Morcott. The heavy doors slammed shut. Silence returned to the foyer. Elara looked up at Arthur. She was shaking. You lied," she whispered, "to save me. You engaged yourself to a pauper to save me from jail." Arthur looked down at her. The anger faded from his eyes, replaced by a terrifying vulnerability. "I have never lied to you, Elara," he said, his voice rough. "I did not kneel because it was a legal loophole. I knelt because it is the truth." He reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead. I have been in the dark for 10 years. You are the only light I have found. If you will have me, if you can bear the burden of a broken man, then let it be real. Ilara stared at him. The silent duke, the beast, the man who had just bowed to her in front of the world. You are not broken, Arthur, she said, tears finally spilling over. You are just unpolished. She stood on her tiptoes and kissed him. It was a chaste kiss, salty with tears, but it sealed the fate of Blackwood Manor forever. The scandal of Arthur Blackwood's engagement did not just ripple through Derbyshire. It crashed through it like a tidal wave. The newspapers in London had a field day. They called Ilara the Maid Duchess, the Library Witch, and the Gold Digger of Blackwood. They said she had bewitched a madman. They said the marriage would not last a month. They said she was unworthy of the silk she wore. But Ilara and Arthur didn't hear them. They were too busy rebuilding a world that had been purposely broken. The days following Julian's expulsion were filled with a frantic, joyous energy. Arthur, fueled by a decade of suppressed rage and newfound purpose, fired the entire household staff that Halloway had hired. He kept only the old groundskeeper and the scullery maid who had been kind to Ilara. He brought in new people, villagers who had been afraid of the mad duke, but now saw a man who paid fair wages and looked them in the eye. Together they scrubbed the gloom from Blackwood Manor. The heavy velvet drapes that had blocked the sun for 10 years were pulled down and burned in a bonfire on the front lawn. The windows were thrown open, letting the crisp autumn air chase away the smell of sickness and arsenic. But the true restoration happened in the West Wing library. It was no longer a dusty tomb. It became the heart of the house. Arthur and Ilara spent their evenings there, not as master and servant, but as partners. They catalogued the books together, Arthur climbing the high ladders his leg had once prevented him from climbing, Ilara documenting the history he had been told to forget. The wedding took place 3 weeks after the confrontation. It was not held in the grand cathedral in the city, as was tradition for a dukedom. It was held in the manor's private chapel, a small stone building covered in ivy. There were no lords or ladies in attendance. The pews were filled with the tenant farmers, the new staff, and the village doctor who had confirmed Arthur's clean bill of health. Ilara did not wear a designer gown from Paris. She wore a dress of cream silk, simple and elegant, that she and the village seamstress had altered from Arthur's mother's collection. She carried no bouquet of expensive orchids, but a bundle of wild heather and ferns, the same ferns that had saved Arthur's life. When the priest asked if anyone objected, the silence was absolute. Julian Thorn was nowhere to be found. As Arthur slipped the heavy gold ring onto Ilara's finger, a ring that had belonged to the first Duchess of Blackwood, he leaned down and whispered, "They will say you are not highborn enough for this ring." Ilara looked up at him, her eyes shining. "Let them say what they want. History is written by the victors, Arthur, and we have won." The fall of the wolf Karma, however, was not finished with Julian Thorn. The story of his downfall didn't happen with a bang, but with a slow, humiliating whimper. After being thrown out of Blackwood Manor, Julian fled to London. Desperate to maintain his lifestyle and convinced that he could still outsmart the world, he invested the last of his hidden funds into a shipping venture that promised high returns. It was a fraudulent scheme. The ships didn't exist. Bankrupt and desperate, Julian tried to forge a letter of recommendation from the Duke to secure a loan. But Arthur had anticipated this. He had placed notices in every major bank in England. Mr. Julian Thorn acts without the authority of the Blackwood estate. Julian was arrested for fraud in a crowded banking hall in Cheapside. The man who had once sneered at Elara for her poverty was dragged away, screaming about his royal connections, wearing a suit he could no longer afford to dry clean. He died 5 years later in a debtor's prison, alone and unmourned. Mrs. Halloway fared little better. Without a reference from the Duke, no respectable house would hire her. Rumour had it, she ended her days working in a fish cannery in the north, her hands that were once too proud to touch dust, now permanently stained with brine and gut. The legacy years turned into decades. The rumours of the mad Duke faded, replaced by stories of the good Duke and his brilliant wife. Arthur and Elara Blackwood became legends, not for their parties, but for their philanthropy. They opened the Blackwood Library to the public, the first of its kind in the county. Scholars from Oxford travelled to Derbyshire not to see the architecture, but to consult with the Duchess, who had become one of the preeminent historians of her time. Arthur never completely lost his silence. He was a man of few words until the day he died. But he was never again the cowering beast in the dark. He was a stoic, powerful presence, usually found walking the grounds with a limp that grew less pronounced with every passing year, always with his wife by his side. On their 40th wedding anniversary, a grand portrait was commissioned. It hangs in the West Wing to this day. It does not show Arthur standing regally with a sword, nor does it show Elara sitting passively with embroidery. It depicts them in the library. Arthur is sitting in his leather chair, a book open in his lap, looking at Elara with an expression of utter, defenseless adoration. Elara stands behind him, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder, her chin lifted in defiance. At the bottom of the frame, instead of the traditional family motto, Elara had instructed the painter to inscribe a new phrase in Latin, Amor, vincit tenebras. Love conquers the dark. History may have said she was unworthy of the title. They said she was a nobody who scraped for pennies in the mud. But when the silent Duke died at the age of 82, his last act was to reach for her hand, and the last thing he saw was not a maid, or an archivist, or a thief. He saw his saviour. He saw his queen, and that, as Elara wrote in the final entry of the archives, was the only title that ever mattered. And that is the story of Elara Vance and Arthur Blackwood. In a world that tried to crush them with rules, class, and poison, they found a way to rewrite their own ending. It reminds us that true nobility isn't about bloodlines or bank accounts. It's about the courage to stand in the light when everyone else is trying to keep you in the dark. Arthur may have been a duke, but it was Elara who possessed the heart of a warrior. If this story moved you, or if you believe that everyone deserves a champion like the Silent Duke, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to share this video with someone who loves a good historical romance with a twist of justice. And if you want more stories about the hidden heroes of history, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss an upload. I'll see you in the next chapter.